Welcome, students, to HI 331, the American Civil War. This video is in lieu of the Winter Revival and the fact that we can't meet in person tonight as I had planned, but the Winter Revival is far more important in my opinion, and so this first video lecture of this 7-week module will be in place of meeting in the Revels building from 7 to 9. Rest assured, next week, Monday night, for the following 6 Monday nights, we'll meet from 7 to 9. And so, on behalf of West Coast Baptist College, I want to welcome you to the American Civil War History course. My name's Randy Wells, and I've been teaching history courses here at West Coast Baptist College since 2014. Just a little bit about me, for those of you that don't know me, maybe this is your first time taking a history course with me. My undergraduate degree is in military history through the American Military University, and my graduate degree is in history through Liberty University. I served for 25 years in the military, retired in 2007 as a Master Sergeant, and through doing some extensive genealogical research several years ago, I was able to find out that I come from a long line of military service. And I was able to trace my lineage all the way back to the 15th century. And one of my relatives, my 15th great-grandfather, fought in the War of the Roses and was killed at the Battle of Towton in the 1400s. It seems at one point or another, relatives on both sides of my family have been fighting in whatever war was popular at that time. I even have a personal tie to this course in that both of my third great-grandfathers fought in the Civil War. And if you look kind of behind me, you'll see like a plaque up on the wall, a shadow box, and both of my third great-grandfathers are sort of memorialized there. One fought in the 10th Ohio Cavalry, and the other one fought in the 174th Volunteer Ohio Infantry. It's my desire that you would enjoy this course. College work, I know, can be tedious at times and certainly requires a great deal of time management. But I have a great passion for history. And again, any of you that know me know that, particularly military history. And it's my desire that you would not only enjoy this class, but you would also do well in it. And so for you to accomplish that, there's going to be some expectations. And if you're following along with me with the slides, PowerPoint slides that I've added to Canvas, and I hope you are, you might want to take a look at those as I'm talking through this video. Number one, if you look at the first slide, you're going to be expected to read the assigned texts, the readings. Now, there's 3 textbooks required for this course. The Great Struggle by Stephen Woodworth, the book on Battles of the Civil War by MacDonald, and then Apostles of Disunion by Charles Dew. Those are 3 books that you definitely are required to read, as well as any handouts that I would add in that particular module for that week. And so if I provide you a handout, it's there for a reason. I expect you to read it. Also, there will be some supplementary videos for you to watch as well, and some of them we'll watch in class together. Now, there won't be a video for every module, but there will be for most. And so just take a note of that. Additionally, you're going to be required to complete 4 quizzes and participate in 6 discussion boards. Now, just a word on the discussion boards. Discussion boards are a critical component of really any history class. And studies have revealed that students who participate in discussion boards, or DBs, increase their retention rate on the particular subject by over 40% compared to just reading a textbook. Now, the requirements for your discussion boards revolve around you answering an initial question, something that I'll post for that week. That'll be your initial posting, and you'll need to post an answer to that posting with at least 250 to 300 words minimum. Your initial posting will be due the Thursday of that week's module, so take note of that, the Thursday. So you'll respond to my initial post with a 250 to 300 word minimum post, which will be due that Thursday. Now, after 12 midnight that Thursday, The discussion board will then close in Canvas. During each discussion board, I'll reply to your initial posting with a follow-up question designed to foster your critical thinking skills. So it's really a two-part thing. You'll then be required to answer this follow-up question with another posting of at least 125 to 150 words, and that will be due by Sunday night at midnight of that week. So your total grade on the discussion board is going to include your initial answer followed by your reply to my follow-up question. Now, with any assignment, make sure that you check your grammar. It's often more advantageous to compose your discussion board in Word and then spell check it and then cut and paste that into the discussion board posting. So 4 quizzes, 6 discussion boards. Also, you're going to be required in this course to complete 1 battle analysis paper. This will be sort of analogous to a research paper, only you'll focus in on one particular Civil War battle. There were hundreds of battles to choose from the American Civil War. So you shouldn't have any problems finding a topic. Then you'll be required also to complete 1 annotated bibliography. Now, for some students, this might be the first time you've ever heard of that. If you've taken a course with me, certainly it's not the first time you've heard of that. I usually require that for every single history class that I teach. But an annotated bibliography, and I might pause and suggest to you strongly that you take advantage of the campus library when you're taking this course. Miss Gregory is phenomenal at assisting students in how to compose a thesis statement, how to perform research, etc. There's also a great deal of sources in the campus library on the American Civil War which will aid you in completing both your annotated bibliography as well as your battle analysis. Then you'll have to complete 1 primary source analysis, and we'll talk about the difference between primary and secondary sources here in a moment. And then 1 final exam. So if you were to achieve the maximum allowable points for all 14 assignments, then you would earn 1,000 points. That's a 4.0. That's a perfect score. That's a perfect A in this course. Slide 2, please. Just some basic ground rules. You'll need to understand the differences in various types of sources that's used in historiography. Historiography is simply the study of history. Next slide. There's a difference between a primary, a secondary, and a tertiary historical source. So let's briefly define each one. Primary sources are contemporary sources or accounts or physical evidence which was written or created during the time period under study. Things like personal journals, diaries, memoirs, recorded or written speeches would all be examples of primary sources. Weapons, articles of clothing, paintings, sculptures, equipment even, would all be examples of primary sources. Next slide. A secondary source interprets or analyzes and assigns value to primary sources. History books, documentary films are good examples of secondary sources. Next slide. A tertiary source are distillations or collections of primary and secondary sources. Things like dictionaries, encyclopedias, guidebooks, bibliographies even are examples of tertiary sources. And by the way, tertiary sources are not acceptable for this course, so please stay away from them. I see a lot of discussion board posts where students will use an encyclopedia, an online encyclopedia as a source. Please do not do that. That's not an accepted source in this course. Next slide. Make sure you only use the Turabian or the Chicago Manual of Style footnote citation method for all writing assignments in this course. For your discussion boards, I expect properly composed footnotes, not endnotes, not a bibliography, but footnotes. For your annotated bibliography, obviously, given the title of the assignment, only bibliography entries are required for that paper, but they need to be done correctly. So let's begin. Next slide. This week we're gonna cover the setting of the stage for disunion and the path to civil war. We'll also explore the firing on Fort Sumter on April of 1861 and the beginning of the war. Most of what we will cover this week occurred up to late 1861. Now, we'll cover this course. It'll be chronological. So, for example, we're not going to start talking about the siege of Vicksburg in week 1 because that doesn't happen until later in the war. There's some interesting facts about the American Civil War that you might find interesting. For one, it cost the lives of some 700,000 Americans, which was analogous to about 2% of the population at that time. Also, any study of warfare is going to involve the use of unfamiliar jargon, unfamiliar to you perhaps. It's virtually impossible to pick up a Civil War history book and not encounter terms like company, regiment, battle, in certain ranks, and the names of certain types of weapons and so forth. And so that'll be something that you'll be exposed to in this course. The Civil War lasted from April of 1861 until General Robert E. Lee's surrender in May of 1865, so it's a 4-year conflict. And unlike wars where Americans deployed to foreign shores or jungles or cities and oceans, the Civil War was fought primarily in 2 main theaters. The Eastern Theater, that would be Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, as well as the District of Columbia, and the coastal fortifications, excuse me, and seaports of North Carolina. So we have the Eastern Theater, and then we have the Western Theater. The Western Theater was made up of Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, North Carolina, Kentucky, South Carolina, Tennessee, as well as Louisiana east of the Mississippi River. And so the dividing line between the 2 theaters was the Appalachian Mountain Range. Most battles in the West, in the Western Theater, were fought on rivers or via riverways, while in the East, troops often would cross the same bodies of water, the Rappahannock River, for example, several times, and fought one another in orchards, fields, cornfields, farmland, and on the outskirts of major cities. Next slide. So as we begin, let's discuss the road to war. The road to war. Next slide. What caused the Civil War? And there's people that are still divided to this day in this country over what we call Civil War causation. Was it slavery or was it states' rights? Now, at this point in the course, if we were together in class, I would show you a video that's produced by Prager University, and it features Colonel Ty Seigel, who's part of the history department at West Point Military Academy. So he would kind of be our guest lecturer for this point in the course. So since we're not meeting in person, you would want to maybe pause and watch that video on your own right now. Now, I think you'll discover after reading Charles Dew's book, Apostles of Disunion, that there's no doubt whatsoever that the primary cause for the Civil War was the issue of slavery. In fact, one of the foundational arguments for Dew's book is his inclusion in Chapter 4 of an 8-page letter that was written by Stephen F. Hale, one of the secession commissioners from Alabama. That letter was written to Kentucky Governor Beriah Magoffin. And the spirit of the letter is Hale trying to sway Governor Magoffin to the South's ideology. Now, folks, relying on primary sources is really the only way we can analyze historiography from an unbiased approach. Because what was written in the past stands, just like the Word of God. So thanks to some fine digital online sources, we can examine the source that Dew used for this book. In fact, let's go ahead and practice kind of doing that very thing, navigating one of these online sources. So next slide. Since we know that Dew cited this source, we can look in his appendix and find where he located the primary source. He states that this document can be found in OR Series 4.1, Series 4, 1 to 4 to 11. And so that means that the letter is in this letter that he wrote to Magoffin is found in Series 4, Volume 1. So we would click on the MOA volumes like you see on the slide. Next slide. We then select Series 4, Volume 1, which brings up that particular volume. Next slide. When you view the contents page, it states correspondence, orders, etc. from December the 20th, 1860 to June the 30th, 1862. Since now we know Hale's letter was written December the 27th, 1860, this has to be the correct volume. And in the search in the text window at the top right, we would type in Maguffin's name, since we know that's who the letter was addressed to, and then we press the Find button. Next slide. Everything pertaining to Magoffin will come up in this when you perform that search. Now I selected the first hit. Next slide. Sure enough, on page 4, there it is. It's dated December the 27th, 1860 at the top. So this has to be the right letter, and you can then scroll through the entire letter, or you can download it as a PDF file, or you can print it for further research. Now, what type of source would Hale's letter to Magoffin be? Well, if you said primary source, then you're absolutely correct. From reading Hale's letter, and I would encourage you to do so, there's no doubt at all in my mind, and hopefully in your mind, that slavery was the core issue of why the South seceded from the Union. And as an historian, we're examining here a primary source which has not been doctored by some sort of a revisionist historian. For some of you, your written assignments for this course, you're going to need primary sources, and this particular website is very valuable, as is the campus library. Next slide. Slavery in America has its genesis as far back to the 17th and 18th centuries. The early Jamestown settlers discovered a lucrative cash crop in growing tobacco. Tobacco plantations sprang up in humid colonies like Virginia and South Carolina, and planters quickly found out that tobacco was a very labor-intensive product, and the amount a planter stood to gain was in proportion to how much tobacco he could harvest. So hired labor was not an option, and as it would have cut into his profit margin. If he was paying somebody to harvest his tobacco, then that's going to cut into the profit margin. So the only solution that these planters saw was non-free labor. So when people from England wanted to come to the New World, but they couldn't afford passage on the ship, they would sell themselves out to work these tobacco plantations as what was called indentured servants. Indentured servitude, and this usually was a 7-year period. Next slide. The shift from indentured servitude to chattel slavery was not something that happened overnight. As lifespans increased, wealthy planters saw slaves as a better overall investment. Slavery had been around since, of course, Bible days. We read about it in the book of Exodus. But the Portuguese, when we think of Western civilization, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, and the English had developed a slave trade in the 1600s that served the colonial empires in Latin America. And by the 1660s, Virginia and Maryland relied almost entirely on slaves versus indentured servants. And again, we would stop here and watch a brief video on the history of slavery. Next slide. The transatlantic slave trade, as it was called, went something like this. Slave ships would leave Europe. They would stop off on the Ivory Coast of Africa, pick up slaves. White slave traders would then trade weapons and other commodities to black slave traders. Once their ships were loaded with as many slaves as they could pack in, they would then make their trek across the Atlantic, bound for the American colonies, while the black slave traders pocketed the money or enjoyed the goods that they had received. This portion of the journey, this part of the leg of the journey from the Ivory Coast to the colonies, was known as the Middle Passage and was the most deadly part of the journey for slaves, and sometimes for the crew as well, due to many slave revolts that occurred. Next slide. In the early 18th century, Barbados planters began migrating to South Carolina, and the slave population in South Carolina grew exponentially. And this caused white slavers to fear potential unrest from slaves, and so the states that had slaves developed what were called slave codes, which were basically laws developed to control the behavior of their slaves. Next slide. The first state or colony to develop slave codes was South Carolina, because it was the only colony where slaves outnumbered whites. And then, of course, other slave states soon followed suit. Next slide. Now, the disconnect in all this was that in the minds of many Americans, essentially those in the North, the Revolutionary War had been fought for liberty and equality. Same reasons for the French Revolution of 1789. Now, after the Revolutionary War, Northerners readily freed their slaves and phased this institution out, but Southerners did not. And this caused an ideological rift in the new nation. There was even a geographical boundary that existed that divided the pro-slave South from the anti-slave North, called the Mason-Dixon line. Next slide. In an effort to appease everyone, various presidential administrations tried various pieces of legislation that led to the secession crisis. And one such law was called the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which provided for the admission of Maine to the United States as a free state, along with Missouri as a slave state. And that way it would maintain the balance of power between the North and the South in the United States Senate. And as part of the compromise, slavery was prohibited north of the 36° 30' parallel, excluding Missouri. Next slide. Of course, this didn't solve the issue of slavery. In 1831, Nat Turner led what is arguably the most famous slave rebellion in the United States, in which he and some other slaves killed over 50 whites. And as a result, the South tightened the reins on slaves and blamed anti-slavery Northerners for the rebellion. Next slide. Another piece of legislation that sought to quell slavery was the Wilmot Proviso. The Wilmot Proviso. This was a bill introduced in 1846 which almost passed. It didn't, but it nearly did. It called for a ban on slavery in the territory that had been acquired by the United States from Mexico during the Mexican War, or after the Mexican War. This is often known as the Mexican Cession. This angered Southerners who wanted to expand slavery into the Southwest. The proviso passed the House but never passed the Senate. Then, shortly after his election as president, President Zachary Taylor tried admitting California into the Union without going through the proper territorial processes, because the California Gold Rush of 1849 was drawing many Eastern settlers to migrate out west. Pro-slavery delegates denounced the proviso in 1849, and Speaker of the House Henry Clay stepped in to offer a compromise to Congress in 1850, which he hoped would appease both sides of the issue. Next slide. This was known as the Compromise of 1850, sometimes called Clay's Compromise. Clay proposed to allow the admittance of California as a free state, which would upset the balance between free and slave state representation in the House. To appease the South, a bill was added as part of the compromise called, next slide, the Fugitive Slave Act, or the Fugitive Slave Law. Southern states, under this law, could send slave catchers into northern states to recapture their runaway slaves. And northern states, under the Fugitive Slave Act, were obliged to help these people catch their runaway slaves. Next slide. 3 years after the passage of Clay's Compromise, President Franklin Pierce became America's 14th president. Pro-slavery Southerners saw the Fugitive Slave Act as unconstitutional and a clear violation of states' rights. When Pierce dispatched army troops to assist Southerners in getting their slaves back, many in the North became full-blown abolitionists. And this, of course, birthed the famous Underground Railroad soon after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. Next slide. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act ended the Clay Compromise and mandated that slavery would be decided by, next slide, popular vote. Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas wanted to expand the railroad across what was as yet unclaimed territory in the United States, and Douglas wanted what became Kansas admitted into statehood so that he could run his transcontinental railroad right through it. So he sets up the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Next slide. We'd watch a video right now on that. Douglas's bill created a political firestorm, as well as birthing a new political party from the age-old Whig Party, which had been around since the Revolutionary War, known as the Republican Party. Next slide. Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act proved even more troublesome, as pro-slavery Missourians wanted Kansas as another slave state. And when the day came for election on the issue, pro-slavery thugs, bullies, entered Kansas and cast fraudulent ballots and threatened voters with violence. We saw some of this same behavior just in the last few weeks with our own presidential election. Next slide. The pro-slavery bullies won, and this sparked what was called Bleeding Kansas. In retaliation, an abolitionist group led by John Brown entered a pro-slavery settlement at the Pottawatomie Creek and slaughtered several men in cold blood. Next slide. The 1856 presidential election saw James Buchanan elected as our 15th president. Next slide. Buchanan's win revealed the growing controversy in the nation and showed the growing power of the Republican Party. Next slide. Right after taking the oath of office, newly elected Democratic President Buchanan saw a chance to solidify slavery across the nation when a slave named Dred Scott sued for his freedom because his owner had brought him to a free state. The case made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. However, next slide, Buchanan convinced the racist Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Judge Taney, Roger Taney, to broaden his decision on the case, which would establish once and for all the legality of slavery. Next slide. Contrary to Buchanan's wishes, the court decision did not end the slavery debate. A rift sprang up in the Democratic Party between the followers of Stephen A. Douglas and those of President Buchanan. And Illinois Republicans endorsed Douglas as their frontrunner for the Senate. Next slide. Despite their endorsement, however, Abraham Lincoln won the nomination for the Illinois Senate in 1858. But he lost it during a series of 7 debates with Douglas. So it would seem that the Democrats would have their way in the Senate after all. But this didn't sit well with the abolition crowd. Next slide. In 1859, John Brown gathered some abolition freedom fighters, and he led a raid on the Union Arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He hoped that after taking the weapons stored in that arsenal, that escaped slaves would rally to his cause, and then he could lead a rebellion more powerfully than the one that Nat Turner led. The raid on Harper's Ferry was suppressed by, ironically, Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee. Yes, the same Robert E. Lee, who will go on to lead the Army of Northern Virginia for the slavery side of the Civil War. Brown was arrested. He was tried for treason and convicted, and then executed by the hangman's noose. Next slide. Of course, this further polarized the nation as America faced the presidential election of 1860. Lincoln, in that election, ran against Douglas. Next slide. Of course, Lincoln won and became our 16th U.S. president. Next slide. The effect of Lincoln's winning the presidency had profound effects. A group of outspoken Southerners called Fire Eaters loudly denounced Lincoln and threatened immediate secession. The Charleston, South Carolina newspaper, called the Mercury, ran an editorial that framed the crisis in familiar terms that were hard to misinterpret. Quote, "The tea has been thrown overboard. The revolution has begun." So that ought to tell you right at the outset that many in the South framed the idea of civil war around the ideology of the Revolutionary War. And so, just like in the Revolutionary War, patriots, colonists, saw Great Britain as this tyrannical form of government, which they were, that was trying to strip the freedoms away from the colonists, which they were. Well, the South of the 1860s saw the North as colonists saw Great Britain during the Revolutionary War, and so hence the editorial that was run in the Mercury newspaper. The Tea, speaking of the Boston Tea Party, has been overthrown, has been thrown overboard, so the revolution has begun. Next slide. So from December 1860 to June of 1861, a total of 11 states chose to secede from the United States and form their own nation known as the Confederate States of America. Next slide. Now, among those newly formed Confederate states, governors appointed spokesmen called secessionist commissioners, who were to travel up and down the states that were yet undecided in an effort to persuade them to their cause. Of course, Charles Dew calls them apostles of disunion. Can anyone think of a modern-day comparison of this, of people traveling up and down trying to get the message across? Well, campaigners, the election campaigns, the things that we have seen splashed all over the news this past year of 2020. That would be sort of a modern-day comparison to this. Next slide. Forming a new government, the secessionist states recognized they needed their own president and constitution, so they chose West Point alum and Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis, a man who had fought in the Mexican War alongside men who would become prominent generals on both sides of the Civil War. He was the new president of the Confederate States of America. The Confederate capital was initially located at Montgomery, Alabama, but was later moved to Richmond, Virginia, and they nearly copied the U.S. Constitution in every respect, except it was pro-slavery and limited the president to a 6-year term of office. Next slide. Lincoln's first test as President of the Union came when Southern leaders demanded that the Union occupy Fort Sumter in South Carolina. I'm sorry, I said that wrong to you guys. Lincoln's first test came when Southern leaders demanded that the Union occupied Fort Sumter in South Carolina be evacuated, because now South Carolina was no longer part of the North, so there was no reason to have U.S. Army troops stationed at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, when South Carolina was now part of the Confederate States of America. Next slide. Lincoln didn't want to be the aggressor. The Union Army was small at that time in history, scattered, mostly out west fighting Indians. Lincoln tried getting a relief expedition through to the men stationed at Fort Sumter, but before it could reach them, President Davis ordered Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard to demand the fort's surrender, and if they refused, they were to destroy it. This small garrison refused, and at 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, the first shot was fired that ignited the Civil War. Next slide. In response to the attack at Fort Sumter, Lincoln put out a call for volunteers to boost the small Federal Army. It should be noted that the United States Army only had around 7,300 men in the years preceding the Civil War. When the Mexican War broke out in 1846, the number of troops rose to around 116,000. But after that war, as has been the case in history for many wars, Congress disbanded the volunteers, the size of the army shrank down, and so forth. Lincoln's call mandated that Union states were to supply 75,000 volunteers to serve for a period of 90 days. Massachusetts became the first state to send men, and after those 90 days elapsed, those volunteers would be free to return home. Obviously, Lincoln, and really no one else at that time, foresaw that the war would last any longer than a couple months. Next slide. So as the war officially began, there were some stark differences between opposing sides. And I'm going to stop right here, and we'll pick up the rest of this on a second video because I'm already at about 34 minutes. And so we'll stop here and pick it up in the next video.